I'm going to have a little bit of help this morning with today's message. Come on up here, big guy. No comments about whether or not he's going to be a future preacher or anything like that. The world and the church can only deal with one Guffey at a time, right? But Isaiah, I asked if he would help me out with this morning's message by telling you a little bit of a backstory that's important before we dive into our text on Mephibosheth. Now, he's a little bit nervous, as you might understand, when you look in the mirror in the morning and you see what I have to face every Sunday morning. He's a little bit nervous as he looks out there, so I want you to treat him better than you treat me, okay? And Isaiah, don't be too nervous. I'll give you a little bit of a tip from a professional here, okay? So that I don't get nervous every Sunday morning, I have a little trick that I don't tell any of these people about. Johnny Allen, would you stand up for a second? I picture Johnny Allen in his underwear every Sunday morning, okay? So just picture that guy in his underwear, and let's go ahead and read this along. Are you ready back there in the back, guys? All right, go ahead.
Once upon a time, the nation of Israel was in search of a king. They wanted a really strong and handsome man like me to lead them. The Lord brought them Saul. The prophet Samuel anointed Saul as king, but he warned him to always obey the Lord. Unfortunately, Saul didn't listen to the prophet, and he made God mad. One day, God was so mad, he said, "I wish I hadn't made Saul king." So God decided that someone else should be the king, a shepherd boy named David. Saul got really mad at David and spent the rest of his life trying to kill David. But not all of Saul's family agreed. Saul had a son by the name of Jonathan, who became best friends with David. They would go hunting and fishing together, play Uno Attack, and watch the Minion movies. In their spare time, they would spend the day teasing David's evil sister Sedalia, making her cry and scream all day long. Jonathan was a lot smarter than his dad, and so one day when he and David were talking, he made David make a promise. He made David promise that when he became king, he would always take care of his family. This was an unusual request, but David promised. Unfortunately, Jonathan died in a nerf war before David became king. But David did become king eventually. I wonder if he kept his promise.
Good job. All right. He does it a lot better than Dad, and all the people said a lot shorter as well. Good job, buddy. Good job. I'm proud of you, man. If you have your Bibles with you this morning, let's turn to 2 Samuel and chapter number 9. You can also kind of find your place in a couple of other passages. In chapter 16 of the same 2 Samuel, we're going to look at verses 1 down to verse 4, and then again in chapter 19 of 2 Samuel, verses 24 down to verse number 30. We want to speak on the subject matter today of Mephibosheth, the beauty of trust and grace. The beauty of trust and grace. Isaiah told us about David's promise to Jonathan which is found for us in 1 Samuel in chapter number 20. But before we go any further today, I want to stop and I want to kind of show you how unusual an arrangement that must have been between David and Jonathan when Jonathan asked David that when he would become king, if he would look after his family for the rest of his life. It's unusual for three reasons. First of all, Jonathan in that moment when he's asking David to make that promise, he's betraying his own father. He's betraying him by hiding David. If you look at the context in 1 Samuel chapter 20, David knows that Saul is on the warpath to try to kill him, but Jonathan does not yet believe that. And so there's a celebration going on, and Jonathan tells David to hide in a field while he goes and talks to his father. And it would have been just as easy for Jonathan to tell his father that David was in the field, but instead he betrayed his own father by telling him that David was somewhere else while he got to the matter as to what was exactly in the heart of Saul. And so David was able to hide there in the field, and Saul was not able to ambush him. But not only is he betraying him in that moment, but he's also betraying his father's legacy and the future in the kingdom of Israel. You see, when God had made Saul the king over Israel, he had promised that if Saul would just obey his commands, he would make his name, his lineage, his legacy, the kingdom forever and ever. He's betraying this in that moment, Jonathan is, for his father, because his father, like any father, would have had great hopes and aspirations for his children, for his lineage to carry on the family business. Now, what strikes me as interesting in all of this, in his betrayal of his father, is what we learn from sociologists and counselors today, that even children who have never met their fathers, met their parents, have an innate desire to please them and to be loyal to them. Yet Jonathan, in this moment, as he makes this covenant with David, he forsakes his own innate desires to protect David and to betray his father. That must have been quite difficult, as for every young man, our fathers are our superheroes. Second of all, what is unusual about this is that Jonathan is not only betraying his father, but he's also betraying his own self. Jonathan is the heir apparent of Israel in this moment. Does he not have the desire to rule and reign over the kingdom, one of the burgeoning kingdoms of all the earth? Does he have no desire for power and wealth? Does he have no desire for victory? If he doesn't, he's quite a different man than most of us encounter on a regular basis. He's giving all of that up by making this covenant with David. Third of all, he's not only betraying his father, not only is he betraying his own self, but he's also betraying history in this moment. You see, the common practice in their world was of legacy purging. When one king was killed, a mad rush to purge their lineage would take place for whoever had assumed power. And he was asking David to forego that history, to forego the natural course of history in this moment, to purge the legacy of Saul and his family heritage. In many cases, it was a brutal process. You might have heard stories about it. One such case that we'll see in a few weeks is the story of a woman queen by the name of Athaliah, found in the Old Testament, who killed her own son to ascend to the throne of a kingdom and reign over a kingdom. So what Jonathan was doing in this moment was he was asking for David to betray history and to do totally the opposite of what most kings did in their time. David would have been acting in accordance with every other king of his time to slaughter the entire family of Saul. There could be no room for espionage by doing that and rebellion from within. It wasn't merely that David needed to fear the Jonathan, and that's why the typical king would have made that purge, but any man that was dedicated to Saul may not be thrilled with the new king, and so the kings would purge not only the house of Saul, but they would in typical order purge all of those who had pledged their allegiance to Saul. By swearing an oath to Jonathan in this moment, David was taking his own life, his reign, and the kingdom into dangerous waters. He was believing that God would protect him in this moment despite what would have been the natural course of history. In fact, we're going to see that actually play out. If we were to continue on with the story from 1 Samuel chapter 20, we would find ourselves to 1 Samuel chapter 31, where we learn that Jonathan and Saul died in the same battle against the Philistines. But apparently not every one of Saul's family died. We learn, first of all, that after his death, after Saul's death, David would be declared king in Judah, but apparently there were still some remnants of Saul in the northern king of Israel. In the north, there was a son of Saul by the name of Ishbosheth. And Ishbosheth was the uncle of the gentleman we're going to encounter today by the name of Mephibosheth. And he would be declared king in 2 Samuel and chapter 2 of the northern kingdom. This is exactly why kings would have purged everybody so that they didn't have to worry about people like Ishbosheth coming upon the scene. For the next 2 years, Israel and Judah, the servants of Ishbosheth and Saul and those of David, are in constant fight with one another. But what happens next is fascinating. We pick up the story in 2 Samuel in chapter number 4. Here we're told for the first time of a son of Jonathan, whom we will later be told was our character for discussion today, a man by the name of Mephibosheth. In verse 4, we are told that he was about 5 years old when news came back about the death of Jonathan on the battlefield. Hearing about the death of Jonathan, a nurse of the family sought to protect this little young man, this little boy, and you would understand why, because it was natural historical tradition to purge the family, right? And so she rushed to the house to grab this boy and hide him. But in her haste, he apparently fell off the traveling cart or perhaps was dropped from a horse. And when he fell, the 2 Samuel writer tells us that he became lame in his feet. We'll return to Mephibosheth in a few moments. But second of all, we're told in that same chapter, in chapter 4 of 2 Samuel, we're told of two men by the name of Rechab and Baanah. Two commanders for Ishbosheth, two men who had served even under Saul himself, of the tribe of Benjamin. Remember that that's where Saul came out of as well. Apparently, however, these men were not as loyal to Saul as we might imagine. They were instead loyal to David, and they sought to bring an end to the civil war that had come about because of the death of Saul and Jonathan. They didn't want the kingdom to be divided any longer. They didn't want David as a king of Judah and Ishbosheth a king over Israel. And so they snuck into Ishbosheth's bedroom during the day while he was taking a nap, and they assassinated him, and they brought his head back to David as a prize. They thought David was going to be grateful, but if they thought that, they were sorely mistaken. In fact, David wasn't happy at all about their act of espionage, because instead David was appalled by what they had done, and he killed the two men and cut off their hands and their feet and strung up their bodies for everybody to watch and to say, "We are not a people who touch God's anointed." Why would he react that way? There's something in that story that gets missed, but it goes all the way back to 1 Samuel and chapter 20. Doesn't David understand in this moment when these two men act in espionage that they had actually helped him out, that he had now become the sole inheritor of the entire kingdom of Israel? Israel and Judah would be united again. The civil war was now over. Of course David knew that, but it's the treachery that he saw in this moment was inadvertently these men had broken a promise that David had given back in 1 Samuel chapter 20. David had told Jonathan that he would protect the family of Saul, and these men had broken David's word, even though they may never have known about what David had said. He could have easily justified it, claiming it wasn't him who had directed it, but David was apparently a man of his word. And he saw this moment, the assassination of Ishbosheth. He saw that moment as a breaking of a covenant, even if it had been done inadvertently. David is anointed the king of Israel, and we have a united kingdom for the first time in many years. His kingdom begins to grow and flourish even as military victory after victory comes, as we see in 2 Samuel chapter 8. God leads before the people of Israel and David and gives them great conquest, expanding the kingdom. He brings riches and wealth to the people. There's commerce in the cities. There's room for excitement, right? The Ark of the Covenant is brought back to Jerusalem, and all the plans begin to be formed so that they can build a great temple. And even David stops and confesses in this moment in chapter 8 that he's excited about the ark coming because, listen, he says to the Lord, "I know that you now dwell with your people." Everything is really going David's way. Spiritually, the kingdom is in growth. Militarily, the kingdom is in growth. It's expanding. From a commerce, from an economic standpoint, the kingdom is in growth. And we're told that all of this was through the divine providence of God. Chapter 8, verse number 15, we're told, so David reigned over all of Israel, and David administered justice and equity for all of his people. We'd love to hear those words spoken about our legislators and judges today, would we not? They ruled with justice and equity for all of the people. But for all of David's success, listen, he never forgot about a promise he made many years before. And then enter into the scene, 2 Samuel chapter 9, and a young man that we will be told is named Mephibosheth. We're told David remembered his promise to Jonathan one day, and he asked in verse 1, is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Apparently, in the midst of all of this growth, in the midst of everything that was going well in the kingdom, David one day was sitting on his throne and he thought to himself, I remember something. I remember that I made a promise many years ago, and I wonder, I've not been able to fulfill that promise, so I wonder if there's anyone left of the house of Jonathan that might be brought before me so that I might show that grace. Someone remembered, apparently listening the king say this, that there was a servant by the name of Ziba who had worked for Saul, and if there was anybody in all the kingdom that would know the answer to David's question, surely it would be Ziba. Ziba was brought before David, and in verse 3, he tells David that indeed there is one sole remaining family member, a son of Jonathan that was still alive, but there was a problem, and that is that Mephibosheth, this son of Jonathan, well, he was crippled in his feet. In other words, he's not going to be able to get here. You're going to have to do something about this. David inquires about his whereabouts, and subsequently, he sends Ziba out to bring him to him. And recorded for us in this one little chapter is one of the most beautiful pictures of grace in all of the Old Testament. You see, beloved, Mephibosheth stands in this moment like you and I, as sons of a king, but crippled, unable to come to the king, unable to come and to claim what we were created for, unable to come to the king and claim the inheritance that was once promised to us. Like Adam and Eve promised to be able to dwell and to commune with God for a lifetime, for all of their life, for all of eternity. That same promise was given to us as members of their genes. And yet sin had separated us, and today we stand like Mephibosheth, crippled, unable to come back and find our way into the kingdom, even though we long to be there. Mephibosheth is summoned, and we pick up his story in 2 Samuel 9 and verse 6. And it says, and Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and listened, and he fell on his face and he paid homage. That opening line really tells us everything that you need to know this morning about the character of Mephibosheth, about the character of this man. You see, beloved, he had spent the last several years depending upon others for charity, right? He'd spent his life as a crippled now because of an unfortunate accident there as people were trying to protect him. And so he lived out needing the charity of others, other people. There was no government social welfare. He needed other people to provide for him. Presumably those who were sheltering him and taking care of him, listen, beloved, they were probably followers of Saul. You can imagine they may not have had very pleasant things to say about David. As they offered Mephibosheth the charity, they might have said things to him like, you are the rightful heir and ruler of Israel, and it's too bad that you're down here. It's too bad that you're living in this estate, this crippledness. It's too bad that you have to live life like this. We know that David has ascended to the throne when the throne was meant for you. Mephibosheth could have been angry about all of that, couldn't he? He could have thought to himself, this isn't fair. There are unfortunate circumstances that have led to my condition. Where was God when I fell off the cart or off the horse? Why didn't somebody protect me more? Why didn't the nurse strap me into the children's safety seat, right? He could have been angry about how David had taken a throne. He might have said to himself, you know what? If David was really an honorable man, when he came into his power, he should have sought me out and placed me into the kingdom. And yet, what we find of Mephibosheth is completely the opposite. When we find him, none of that is seen. No anger, no frustration, no bitterness. Instead, what we find is a man who bows himself before the king, who ruined his family legacy, who stands in the position that was rightfully his, and instead of anger, what Mephibosheth shows is respect and submission. At the end of verse number 6, he says, "Behold, I am your servant." What a statement. What kind of a servant could he even be in this moment? He was lame. I mean, this is not even much of a request, right? I mean, when he says to David, "I'm your servant," David might have said, "Wait a second. How are you going to serve me? You're crippled. I'm the slayer of giants and the slayer of lions and bears, the protector of sheep. I've had military victories, and the people sing of my accolades of killing thousands of people for the nation of Israel and the glory of God. How are you, a crippled boy, going to help me, Mephibosheth?" And yet Mephibosheth was saying in that moment that his hate and anger that might have once consumed him was gone. And in its place knelt a man who surrendered his life for whatever value it was to the service of the king. "I may not be worth much, David, but here I am, this crippled man, a servant of yours." David decrees in verse number 7 that he would not only purge Mephibosheth, but that he would restore to him the lands of his family. David says, "I want you to know there's some property out there that used to belong to your family, so it's going back to you." And then David goes a step further and he tells him that you don't have to even worry about that land because, Mephibosheth, you will always have a seat at my table. Mephibosheth's response is telling in verse number 8. He paid homage and he said, "What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I?" Why in the world would you do this, David? I am nothing. Not even the slightest hint of self-amusement, not even the slightest hint of pride in this moment. Instead, we find in the character of Mephibosheth humility. When he considered his life, he thought he was nothing that a king would want to honor him. He was nothing that a king would want to be so kind to him. He was nothing that a king could find use for him. And yet, David was not an ordinary king. David goes on to decree that all the lands of Saul should be given to Mephibosheth. And since he cannot work them for himself because of his crippledness, Ziba and all of his family should be stewards of the land. And again, we're told in verse number 10 that Mephibosheth would say to this that he would rather stay and eat in the king's palace than to go live on the lands that David had given. At the end of verse 11, so Mephibosheth, it says, ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Verse 13, so Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both of his feet. Over and over again, the Samuel writer tells us that while David was offering him the land, the wealth, and the power of his father and his grandfather, Mephibosheth just kept saying over and over again, I don't need all of that. What I want to do is just stay here at your table and eat with you in your presence. As such, the story of Mephibosheth, before we press any further, we need to acknowledge that the story of Mephibosheth relays to us two important truths this morning. First is found in the integrity of David, isn't it? That he would keep his promise to Jonathan even though years had passed and there was nothing to hold him to his word except his own integrity. David didn't have to honor this request. He didn't have to honor this covenant. Who would have even known if he had broken his promise to Jonathan? August the 14th, 2015, CNN ran a story about a man by the name of Mitsuaki Omata. This Omata had sought for the past 70 years to fulfill his father's dying request that he had promised to do. His story really begins all the way back on April the 2nd, 1945, in a small field just outside of Tokyo, where a young man and his father were crouching in a bomb shelter as they watched a squadron of American B-29 bombers fly overhead. As the barrage of anti-aircraft fire found its way into the sky, suddenly one of the bombers began to smoke. They watched in horror as the plane descended in a free fall, landing a few meters away in a blaze in extreme heat. All of the crew were dead, 11 servicemen, including one 21-year-old airman from Illinois named Wallace Pitts. Even though Japan and the United States were at war, Omada's father turned to his son, a devoted Buddhist, and he said he'd made a decision. He believed that these servicemen should have a place of rest, of dignity. And so the father and son began to gather the servicemen's remains, and they placed them in their own ancestors' tombs there just outside of Tokyo. The father then stated to the son that this should be done out of respect. Specifically, he said, respect for a fellow human, even if that human is our enemy. After the war was ended, a monument was erected with the words by the Omada family to pray for the peace of human beings and the world and console the spirits of the courageous 11 U.S. crew members of the bomber B-29, which crashed on this spot during the last World War. I have erected this monument to wish that these 11 brave men should sleep here peacefully amongst my family forever. The father had one final request before he died for his son. He wanted his son to find each of the servicemen's family and to notify them of their final resting spot and the story of their death. For 70 years, the families of the servicemen only knew that their families were listed officially by the United States government as missing in action. Nobody really knew what had happened to them. Until 70 years later, in 2015, the final family, the Pitts family from Illinois, were tracked down by Omada and brought to the resting place of their family. Interesting. Integrity is an interesting thing, isn't it? It's what binds us to our promise when nothing else does. David showed immense integrity in this moment. He had nothing that bound him to the promise he had made to Jonathan. Nobody even knew about the promise because after all, Jonathan and David had made it in the secrecy of a field while they were watching out for Saul and the army that wanted to kill David. Nothing held him to his word, and yet something in him, and I believe it was his integrity, something in him said, you have to honor what you have spoken. Beloved, when time and circumstances have erased the need to fulfill a vow, integrity and honor remind us of the words once spoken in earnest to be fulfilled, even if it means fulfillment in our final breath. Douglas Moore tells us a story of Booker T. Washington about how he met an ex-slave from Virginia. And Washington writes, I found that this man had made a contract with his master 2 or 3 years previous to the Emancipation Proclamation to the effect that the slave was to be permitted to buy himself by paying so much per year for his body. And while he was paying for himself, he was so permitted to labor for whomever and wherever he pleased. Finding that he could secure better wages in Ohio, he left Virginia for that wonderful state. When freedom came, he was still in the debt of his master, some $300. Notwithstanding that the Emancipation Proclamation had freed him from any obligation to his master, this black man, Washington writes, walked the greater portion of the distance all the way back to where his old master had lived in Virginia, and he placed the last dollar with interest into the master's hands. Booker concludes, in talking to me about this, the man told me that he knew that he did not have to pay his debt, but that he had given his word to his master, and his word he had never broken. He felt that he could not even enjoy freedom until he had fulfilled his promise. David had nothing that tied him to Jonathan any longer, except that he knew that he would never enjoy the full beauty of the kingdom until he was freed from that oath that he had given to Jonathan. I think there is one other thing that's worth noting in 1 Samuel chapter 20. When David made that promise to Jonathan, interestingly enough, he actually covenanted with God. That is, that even though he was making a promise to Jonathan about providing for his family, he was actually saying that God would judge over him as to whether or not he had been faithful in this matter. Even though Jonathan had died, the promise that David had made to God, well, that was a promise that still needed to be kept because God never takes such things lightly. I remember in one of my first churches that I served as an intern over the summer to work with youth, there was a pastor that had come to the church and he'd been very faithful for a couple of years and the church had grown. But then something inside the pastor changed. Something in him changed to where he began to maybe relax a little bit and be less passionate about the ministry that God had called him to. And so oftentimes he couldn't be found out visiting his parishioners or doing his daily duties. Oftentimes he would in fact even lie about where he was at so that he could go out to the lake and fish because he enjoyed it, or go over to the local golf course and play golf. Something had changed deep down inside of him. But interestingly enough, the church some years before had made a covenant with the minister that they would build him a house and they would pay for its completion. And so when the pastor had neglected his duties and the situation became so tenuous and stressed that he could no longer serve faithfully, and he resigned his position, there was a business meeting held. And it was the very first business meeting I was a part of. And as member after member stood up, they talked about this loan on a house that they had promised to pay for the pastor some years before. There wasn't a great amount that was still owed on it, something about $50,000 or $60,000. And one by one, member after member said, you know, this guy has been taking advantage of us for 6 or 7 years. We don't owe him another dime. And the crowd got a little bit ruckus until eventually an elderly gentleman stood up. And apparently he had been one of the trustees who had originally given his word to help get this house paid for. He stood up in the midst of the crowd and everybody kind of got quiet, and he said simply, men and women, I don't agree with how we've been treated, and I agree with much of the sentiment that's been spoken in this room tonight about the things that have happened that were wrong to this church. But one thing I know, 10 years ago when we built that house, I promised God and a man that we would pay for it. And we are responsible to keep our end of the bargain. Beloved, when you make a promise to God, it doesn't matter your circumstances. It doesn't matter your situations. It doesn't matter how all of that has changed. What matters is you made a promise to God, and God expects you to honor it. Second, we see in the story of Mephibosheth the gospel itself. It serves, as I mentioned earlier, really a picture of us. We are described in Ephesians 2 as dead in our trespasses and sin. That is, that we are unable to come to God, approach God. We need some supernatural intervention. We need God to do what He promised He would do through the prophet Jeremiah, that He would take our hearts of stone and make them soft and pliable, that He would intervene into our lives. Mephibosheth's lame feet, they present a picture of the inability of man to enter into the kingdom that we were created for on our own strength and power. Much had happened since the death of his father. Blood had been shed, bonds had been formed, kingdoms had been uprooted. There must have been something in Mephibosheth that asked, does David even know who I am? And if he does, what would he possibly want with a crippled man like me? I am nothing more than a lame man of no use to anybody. When Saul had reigned, he had dreamed of his family continuing the lineage of royalty. But sin had destroyed all of that. Saul's anger and unlawful sacrifice and his jealousy had made none of that possible. The palace might have been made for him. It might have been designed for Mephibosheth. Might have had him in mind when it was made. But listen, he wasn't welcome there. And these are the lies, beloved, that we tell ourselves even about God. God doesn't want me there. Even if He did, I can't get there on my own. And if I could somehow find the way to get there, what use could I possibly be for God? What use could I possibly be for the kingdom? In the words of Mephibosheth, we say to ourselves, I'm just a dog. I'm worthless. God couldn't possibly use me. But David serves as the foretelling of Christ, bidding us to come by His invitation to dine with Him in His glorious kingdom. And while some want the riches and the land and the tithes and the titles, like Mephibosheth, we who have tasted of the king's goodness, we want only to have a simple seat at his table. The enemy says this morning, beloved, you're worthless. Your own experience tells us you have nothing to offer to God. But God says, come, I've made a way. Come, I've made a way through the shed blood of my Son, through the faith in Christ's work on Calvary on your behalf. I've got a place for you at my table. Interestingly enough, Mephibosheth's story isn't quite over. David had several sons. One of them was named Amnon, and he had another by the name of Absalom. You've probably heard Absalom's story throughout the years. He also had some daughters, and one of them in particular was by the name of Tamar. Unfortunately, there was not always peace in David's home, unlike our homes that are always peaceful all the time. And in chapter 13 of 2 Samuel, we are told the story of an incestuous evil desire on the part of Amnon. He was so struck by his sister Tamar's beauty that we are told in verse 2 that he was tormented in his soul. He was literally sick over her. Since it was impossible for him to have her, he decided to take her by force and he raped her. Absalom was filled with rage. This was his full-blooded sister. And for 2 years, he plotted a way to kill Amnon, and eventually he succeeded. But this was not going to be the end. Absalom, once he had a taste for blood, decided that not only did he want to kill his brother, but he also wanted to rule and reign over the kingdom of Israel. And through cunning and deceit, he turns the people of Jerusalem, their hearts against their own king, his father David, so that David is forced to flee from Jerusalem in fear of his life. And as David is fleeing the countryside, an interesting figure reappears in chapter 16, verses 1 down to verse number 4. There's Ziba, that servant who first brought Mephibosheth to David. That servant entrusted to care for Mephibosheth's inheritance. He comes riding out to David with quite a gift. He comes with donkeys, 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and a skin of wine. If not for that last line, we might have said it just sounds like an ordinary Baptist potluck, right? We might assume that Mephibosheth is repaying the kindness of David once shown to him, right? Maybe Mephibosheth knew what was going on, and so he sent his servant out to give him some of the inheritance. He knew David was going to need it. But beloved, we might be assuming too much. For David asked why Ziba has brought this gift to him. And there in chapter 16 and verse number 2, it says, Ziba answered, the donkeys are for my king's household to ride on, the bread and the summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who faint in the wilderness to drink. To which David responds, where is your master's son? Where's Mephibosheth, Ziba? If this is all from him, why isn't he out here with us? And Ziba responds in verse number 3, behold, he remains in Jerusalem, for he said, today the house of Israel will give me back the kingdom of my father. Oops, that's not the Mephibosheth we once knew. Mephibosheth, who came and said he was nothing more than a worthless dog, now apparently Ziba says, no. Mephibosheth has changed sides, David. Mephibosheth has decided that if he were to desert you, abandon you, that he would be able to stay in Jerusalem. And there maybe Absalom would give him back at least portion of the kingdom. And then the story all of a sudden takes a U-turn. Fast forward to chapter number 19, pick it up in verse 24. Absalom is dead and David has returned as king. And he's showing mercy to the many people who had betrayed him. And who do we find arriving? Mephibosheth one more time. Only things don't seem the way Ziba had painted them. Instead, in the coming verses, Mephibosheth arrives in ragged clothes, dirty, smelly, beard unkept, like Johnny Allen. And all in all, he's just a real mess, right? And he tells David that he had asked Ziba, when David was fleeing, he says, I told Ziba to prepare a donkey for me so that I could follow with David in his departure. But that dirty, rotten scoundrel, Ziba, he prepared a donkey and then he left me at home. Distraught over his inability to come with David, he vowed in that moment, Mephibosheth says, to not take a bath or clean myself up until the king had returned. Boy, what would you have done if you were David? I mean, you got competing stories. Ziba says, this guy doesn't want to trust you, doesn't want to go with you. Mephibosheth says, no, look at me. I've been loyal to you even to the very end. I've waited here with anxiousness for your return. So what David does is he decides, if you can't discern the truth of the matter, divide things in half. And so he tells Mephibosheth that he will divide his land between he and Ziba. But check this out, and it tells us everything we need to know. Verse number 30, and Mephibosheth said to the king, oh, let him take it all, since my lord the king has come home safely. Mephibosheth said, David, you've missed the point. I never cared about any of that. I never cared about the land and the properties. I never cared about the stewardship. I never cared about leaving even my children an inheritance. What I cared about was I wanted to live in your presence. And now that you're back, I don't want those other things. I'll just simply live in your presence. That last single line tells us everything we need to know about Mephibosheth. When David offered the lands of his father and grandfather, even if they were to be cut in half, he said, no, I just want to eat at your table. When David realized he had been duped into giving away half of Mephibosheth's land and wealth, and he sought to remedy it by giving him back some of it, Mephibosheth said, no, I don't need that. I am just glad to be in your presence. Reminded me of a story of a woman in Matthew chapter 15 and verses 21 down to verse number 28. There we encounter a Gentile woman from Tyre and Sidon. And she comes to Jesus crying, and she tells him in verse number 22 that she has a daughter that's been oppressed by a demon. Jesus did what Jesus always does, right? He ignored her. Something unexpected. We thought maybe he would wave his hand and cast out the demon, but he doesn't. Instead, he ignores the woman's request, and she just continues to come after them. And when it didn't work that he just ignored her, he sent her away with a dismissive statement in verse 24. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. What are you bothering me for, essentially? I didn't come for Gentiles. I didn't come for the people of Tyre and Sidon. I came for the people of Israel. Get away from me. Undeterred, the woman who comes one more time, and she throws herself at the feet of Jesus and she begs for his help. One last time, he dismisses her in verse 26. It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. What a statement. Jesus was calling this Canaanite woman, this Gentile woman, a dog. I'm not going to heal you. I'm not going to heal your daughter. Yeah, I understand the pain. Yes, I understand the oppression of a demon. But listen, I came for Israel. They're my children. I'm not going to take away from them the power that was given to me. I'm not going to take away from them that and give it to you, because the dogs don't get fed with the children's food. To which the woman responds in great faith in verse 27. Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Beloved, many want fame and glory. They want riches and celebrity. In fact, I learned this week that entire apps have been redeveloped in 2019 so that your children can post vlogs all the time with the singular purpose of making them celebrities. Did you know that? Of course you didn't, because we never check our kids' phones, right? Take them away, because they're downloading this app. I can't even remember what the name of it is. I'll tell you next week. And there is singularly designed for them to communicate in such a way, and it goes out to all kinds of strangers so that they can grow in fame and status. People in our culture now have designed themselves to live in such a way that their only goal is, I want to be famous. Want to promote themselves. But the heart of Mephibosheth, the heart of the Canaanite woman of Matthew 15, and every person who has ever tasted the grace of Christ is quite different this morning. Because of Jesus this morning, I know how unworthy I am. And beloved, I just want a seat in his kingdom. Doesn't matter whether I get rich and famous and powerful. I don't even want the best seat in the kingdom. I'll take a seat all the way at the end of the table, where I only eat what the rest of you have picked through. I'll sit below the table if that's what he wants, because the crumbs from the king's table are better than the feast of the world for all of eternity. We used to sing the sweet refrain, I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather be his than have riches untold. I'd rather have Jesus than houses or lands. I'd rather be led by his nail-pierced hand. I'd rather have Jesus than men's applause. I'd rather be faithful to his dear clause. I'd rather have Jesus than worldwide fame. I'd rather be true to his holy name than to be a king in a vast domain or to be held in sin's dread sway. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. Beloved, Jesus offers us a seat in the kingdom today. We have to decide if we'd rather be in his palace, at his table, or to have our own land. Mephibosheth said, I'll lose the land. Let me sit in the presence of the king. It's a powerful story of the importance of keeping our word this morning, isn't it? David kept a promise to Jonathan. He kept it through war and revolt. He kept it through when the kingdom was doing well. He kept it when it seemed like he had been duped. He just continued to keep his word. Mephibosheth, he kept a promise to David. When another came into power, Mephibosheth sought to stay with his king, the David, right? He kept his honor. There are few things people will remember more in this world than when you keep your word. Did you know that? There are few things that people will remember in this world like when you keep your word. But most importantly, Mephibosheth's story is a story of grace. Listen to me closely. This morning, the king welcomes each and every one of you into his palace. He welcomes each and every one of you to feast in his goodness and to share in his riches. Beloved, you only have to decide whether you'd rather sit at the king's table than party on your own property, so to speak. Mephibosheth found out being in the king's presence was far better than anything he'd give up to be there. This morning, Jesus is worth far more than all you'll lose. Even if you lost the entire world and the riches of this life, life with Jesus is far better than any life without him.